The dusty streets of Cedar Valley fell silent as 12-year-old Sarah clutched the faded photograph in her trembling hands. She'd walked 300 miles through scorching desert and bitter mountain passes, following whispers and rumors about a man who might be her father. When she spotted elder Thomas Whitman loading supplies outside the general store, her heart stopped. The same weathered face, the same steel-gray eyes from her mother's dying words. "You're coming with me, I need a father," she declared, grabbing his arm with desperate strength. Thomas Whitman froze, his blood turning to ice. This couldn't be happening. Not now, not after 20 years of hiding. He'd buried his past as Dead-Eye Tom, the most feared gunslinger in 3 territories. He'd found God, found peace, found a new life among the faithful. But this girl, this impossible girl, carried more than just resemblance. She carried danger. Behind her, dust clouds rose on the horizon. The bounty hunters who'd been tracking her had found them both. His old life was calling, and running was no longer option. But what secret was this orphan girl really hiding that made killers chase her across 2 states? Thomas stared down at Sarah's dirt-streaked face, his mouth suddenly dry as desert sand. The photograph trembled in her small fingers, a tintype of a younger man with his exact features but wearing the black hat and gun belt he'd sworn never to touch again. His carefully constructed world of morning prayers and evening scripture readings crumbled in an instant. "Child, you've got the wrong man," he whispered, though his voice carried no conviction. The lies felt heavy on his tongue, 20 years of practiced denial suddenly worthless against the truth, staring up at him with his own grey eyes. Sarah's grip tightened on his sleeve. "Mama said you'd deny it. She said you'd try to run." Tears carved clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. "But she told me about the scar on your left hand, the one shaped like a horseshoe." Thomas's right hand instinctively moved to cover the old wound, hidden beneath work-worn leather gloves he'd worn every day since arriving in Cedar Valley. No one here knew about that scar. No one knew about anything from before. "She said to tell you that Rose McKinnon never forgot you, and neither did your daughter." The name hit him like a physical blow. Rose. Sweet, laughing Rose with her copper hair and fierce spirit. The woman he'd left behind when the law closed in, when loving her meant putting her in danger. He'd written her one letter explaining why he could never return, never knowing. Rose had a child? The words escaped before he could stop them. Sarah nodded vigorously. "Me. She died of the fever last month, but before she passed, she made me promise to find you. She said you were the only family I had left." Thomas felt the familiar weight of the Colt. 45 he kept hidden beneath loose floorboards in his modest cabin. 20 years of Sunday services, of helping neighbors raise barns and comfort the grieving, of building something decent from the ashes of a violent life. All of it meaningless now. The dust clouds on the horizon grew larger, more distinct. 3 riders, moving fast and purposeful. His practiced eye counted horses, estimated distance, calculated time before they arrived. Old instincts died hard. "Sarah, listen to me carefully," he said, kneeling to meet her eye level. "Those men following you, what do they want?" Her face went pale. "Mama never told me much, just that some bad men came looking for something a few days before she died. They tore our cabin apart, said she stole something valuable. When she wouldn't tell them where it was, they—" She swallowed hard. "They hurt her. Real bad." Thomas's jaw clenched. The gentle Mormon elder warred with the killer he used to be, and for the first time in decades, he wasn't sure which would win. "Do you know what they're looking for?" Sarah reached into her worn coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Mama sewed this into my dress before I left. Said to give it to you that you'd know what to do." Thomas opened the pouch with careful fingers. Inside lay a small brass key and a folded piece of paper covered in Rose's delicate handwriting. His heart sank as he read the words, "Safety Deposit Box 247, First National Bank, Prosperity Wells. What we took from the Jameson gang is yours now. Keep our daughter safe. All my love, Rose." The Jameson gang. Thomas closed his eyes, remembering his last job before going straight, a train robbery that had gone wrong, leaving 5 men dead and a fortune in stolen gold unaccounted for. Rose had been there that night, had helped him escape when everything fell apart. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. "Sarah," he said quietly, standing and taking her small hand in his gloved one, "I think it's time you met your father properly." The girl's eyes held a fierce certainty that made Ezra's stomach turn. She clutched his sleeve with dirt-caked fingers, her voice rising above the evening wind that swept across the dusty main street of Millfield. "I knew you'd come back, Papa. I knew you wouldn't leave me forever." Ezra tried to step away, but her grip tightened. Around them, curious townspeople had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. He recognized the baker's wife, the blacksmith, young Tom Morrison from the general store. Their faces showed a mixture of surprise and interest that made his skin crawl. "Child, I'm afraid you've made a mistake," Ezra said, his voice gentler than he intended. "I'm not your father." The girl's face crumpled, but only for a moment before her jaw set with stubborn determination. "You look different, but I'd know you anywhere. Your eyes, they're the same. And your hands." She grabbed his weathered palm, tracing the scar that ran from his thumb to his wrist. "You got this when you were fixing the roof. You told me about it." The scar had come from a knife fight in Dodge City, 15 years past. Ezra pulled his hand free, alarm bells ringing in his mind. "What's your name, child?" "Sarah. Sarah McKenna." "And you're James McKenna, my papa." Her voice carried across the gathering crowd with absolute conviction. Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife, pushed forward. "Ezra, what's this about? Who is this girl?" Before he could answer, Sarah spun toward the woman. "His name isn't Ezra. It's James McKenna, and he's my papa. He's been gone for 2 years looking for work, but now he's come back for me." The crowd murmured, and Ezra felt their eyes studying him with new interest. He'd been in Millfield for 3 years, keeping to himself, attending Sunday services, working odd jobs. A quiet, unremarkable man with a Mormon background and tired eyes. But now this girl was weaving a different story around him, one that threatened to unravel everything. "The child is confused," Ezra said firmly. "I've never seen her before in my life." Sarah's face went white, then flushed red with anger. "How can you say that, after what we've been through? After Mama died and you promised you'd always take care of me?" Her voice broke on the last words, and something twisted in Ezra's chest. The girl was thin, too thin, and her clothes were worn nearly to rags. Fresh bruises marked her arms, and her hair hung in matted tangles. Whatever her story was, she'd been through hell. "Where are you from, Sarah?" he asked, despite himself. "Redemption. 3 days' ride north." She wiped her nose with her sleeve. "I walked most of the way. Been looking for you for weeks." Redemption. Ezra knew the name. A struggling mining town that had seen better days. If the girl had truly walked from there, she was either remarkably determined or completely desperate, possibly both. Tom Morrison stepped closer, his young face bright with curiosity. "Maybe she's right, Mr. Ezra. Maybe you just forgot. Head injuries can do that, can't they?" "I haven't had any head injuries," Ezra said sharply, "and I've never been to Redemption." "That's a lie!" Sarah's voice cracked like a whip. "You took me there when I was little. You worked in the Silver Bell mine until it played out. Then you said you had to find work somewhere else, but you'd send for me. You promised." The crowd was growing larger, and Ezra felt trapped in their circle of curious faces. This was exactly the kind of attention he'd spent years avoiding. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to let them sort it out without him. But something in the girl's desperate eyes held him fast. "Even if what you're saying were true," he said carefully, "I'm not the man you're looking for." Sarah studied his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You're scared," she said suddenly. "That's why you're pretending you don't know me. Someone's after you, isn't they?" The words hit too close to home. Ezra forced his expression to remain neutral, but Sarah's eyes sharpened. "That's it, isn't it? You had to change your name. That's why everyone here calls you Ezra." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "What happened, Papa? What did you do?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Around them, the crowd leaned in, eager for his answer. Mrs. Patterson's face showed concern mixed with suspicion. Tom Morrison looked fascinated. Others whispered among themselves, and Ezra caught fragments of their speculation. This was spiraling beyond his control. If he didn't end it now, the girl's wild story would take root, and questions would follow, questions he couldn't afford to answer. But as he looked down at Sarah's upturned face, bruised, desperate, clinging to hope like a drowning person clutches driftwood, he found himself frozen between compassion and self-preservation. In that moment of hesitation, everything changed. The girl's fever broke sometime during the night, but her delirium lingered like smoke from a dying fire. She muttered names Samuel didn't recognize, Maria, Papa, someone called Cisco, and clutched at his sleeve whenever he tried to move away from her bedside. By dawn, Samuel had made his decision. The smart thing would be to take her to the nearest settlement, hand her over to whatever passed for authority, and wash his hands of the whole affair. But looking at her small frame wrapped in his spare blanket, her dark hair matted with sweat and dust, he couldn't bring himself to abandon her to strangers who might not care whether she lived or died. Besides, she'd called him Papa. The word had stirred something in him that he'd thought long buried, a longing he'd carried for the children he'd never had, the family that might have been if he'd made different choices 20 years ago. When she finally opened her eyes fully, they were clear brown and sharp with intelligence. She studied his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as if she were cataloguing every line and scar. "You came back," she said simply. Samuel handed her a cup of water. "Drink slow." She obeyed, though her eyes never left his face. "I knew you would. Mama always said you'd come for me when I needed you most." The certainty in her voice twisted something in Samuel's chest. He'd spent years seeking redemption through prayer and solitude, but this felt different, like Providence had dropped a second chance at his doorstep, even if it was built on a foundation of mistaken identity. "What's your name, child?" "Esperanza Morales." She struggled to sit up straighter. "But you can call me Espy, like before." Samuel helped prop her against his saddle. The surname meant nothing to him, which should have been a relief, but the girl's absolute faith in their connection unsettled him more than recognition would have. "Espy, I need to ask you something important, and I want you to think careful before you answer." He crouched beside her. "What makes you so certain I'm your father?" She reached into her shirt and pulled out a small piece of paper, worn soft from handling. "Mama drew this before she died. She said you had kind eyes and a scar right here." Her finger traced a line along his left temple where an old bullet graze had left its mark. Samuel's blood chilled as he looked at the crude pencil sketch. The face staring back at him could indeed be his own, or any number of weathered men who'd lived hard lives under the desert sun. But the scar was positioned exactly right, and the eyes, whoever had drawn this, had captured something he recognized in his own reflection. "Where did your mama see me?" "In Socorro. She said you were passing through and you were kind to her when others weren't." Espy's voice grew smaller. "She said you had to leave, but you promised to come back." Socorro. Samuel had been through that town, but not recently. Not in the 15 years since he'd abandoned his old life. Someone else had been there. Someone who resembled him enough to fool a grieving woman and her desperate daughter. The realization should have made it easier to tell her the truth. Instead, it complicated everything. If there was another man out there who looked enough like him to be mistaken for her father, then Samuel wasn't just dealing with a case of mistaken identity. He was potentially walking into someone else's troubles. "Espy, what happened to your mama?" The girl's face darkened. "Men came looking for you. They said you took something that wasn't yours and they wanted it back." Her hands clenched into small fists. "When Mama told them she didn't know where you were, they hurt her. She got sick after, and never got better." Samuel felt the familiar weight of guilt settle on his shoulders, though this time it wasn't his own sins causing the burden. Somewhere out there, a man who shared his face had left behind a woman and child to face the consequences of his actions. The parallel to his own past was too close for comfort. These men, did they say what I took? They kept asking about a strongbox, said it had money that belonged to their boss. Espy's voice dropped to a whisper. Mama said she burned all your things after you left, but they didn't believe her. They tore our house apart looking. A strongbox. Money that belonged to someone else. Samuel had stolen plenty of strongboxes in his outlaw days, but that was decades ago. This was someone else's crime, someone else's past coming back to haunt an innocent family. But as he looked at Espy's trusting face, Samuel realized the distinction might not matter. She needed protection, and she needed answers about what had happened to her mother, whether he was her real father or not. He was the only help she had. And perhaps that was enough reason to see this through, wherever it might lead. The girl's fever broke sometime before dawn, her small body finally relaxing against the makeshift bedroll Samuel had fashioned from his coat and saddlebags. He'd spent the night feeding the fire and watching her breathe, memories of another child's labored breathing echoing in his mind, memories he'd worked 15 years to bury. When she woke, her eyes were clearer but still held that desperate gleam that made his chest tighten. She sat up slowly, studying his weathered face in the morning light filtering through the cave entrance. "You came back for me," she whispered, and the wonder in her voice cut him deeper than any accusation could have. "Course I did." The words came out rougher than he intended. "Name's Samuel. Samuel Cartwright. I'm Rose." She paused, then added with fierce certainty, "Rose McKinnon. Your daughter." The name hit him like a physical blow. McKinnon. He kept his face carefully neutral, but his mind raced. There'd been a McKinnon family on a homestead outside Bitter Creek, back when he'd ridden with the Torino gang, back when blood and gunpowder had been his trade instead of scripture and salvation. "Child, I told you yesterday." "No." She struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. "Mama said you'd come back. She said you promised, said you had kind eyes and gentle hands, and that you'd never really leave us, not forever." Samuel's hands trembled as he poked at the dying fire. Gentle hands. Sarah McKinnon had said that, the night he'd helped deliver her first child during a blizzard that had trapped him at their homestead. The night he'd been running from a botched robbery that had left 2 men dead. The night Thomas McKinnon had been away buying cattle, and Samuel had lied about his name and his purpose. The night he'd fallen in love with a married woman and pretended for 3 days that he could be the man she deserved. "Your mama," he said carefully. "What happened to her?" Rose's face crumpled. "The fever took her last winter. Before she died, she made me promise to find you. Said you'd gone west to make a new life. Said you'd take care of me like you promised." Her voice broke. "I've been looking for so long, Papa. So long." The cave felt suddenly airless. Samuel stood abruptly, needing movement, needing distance from the hope in her eyes. Outside, the morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day that usually reminded him of God's grace. Instead, it felt like judgment. He'd never touched Sarah McKinnon, never acted on the feelings that had torn through him during those 3 snow-to-locked days. But he'd wanted to. Lord forgive him, he'd wanted to abandon everything, his outlaw life, his gang, even his own name, and stay in that warm cabin with her gentle laugh and her husband's trusting smile. Instead, he'd left before dawn on the 4th day, riding hard for the territorial line with Thomas McKinnon's grateful blessing and a promise to return someday, a promise he'd never intended to keep. Rose. He turned back to find her standing in the cave mouth, still pale but determined. "I need you to listen careful like. I ain't your father, but you came back." "I came back because it was the Christian thing to do, because no child deserves to die alone in the wilderness." He softened his voice, seeing her flinch. "Your real father, what was his name?" "James," she said without hesitation. "James McKinnon. Mama said he was tall and had scars on his hands and that he sang hymns while he worked." Her chin lifted defiantly. "Just like you were doing yesterday." Samuel's blood turned to ice. James McKinnon. Not Thomas. The baby Sarah had been carrying when he'd left, the child he'd helped bring into the world during that blizzard, had been a boy. This girl was younger, maybe 8 or 9, young enough to have been born a year after he'd left, young enough to have been conceived during those 3 days when longing and snowfall had trapped them together in ways that had nothing to do with weather. His hands found his Bible automatically, fingers tracing the worn leather binding. He'd spent years atoning for his outlaw past, years believing he'd found redemption in service to God and community, but standing here, looking at Rose's defiant, trusting face, he realized some sins cast longer shadows than others. "The men who were chasing you," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "What did they want?" "They said Papa owed them money, said he'd stolen something that belonged to them." Rose's face hardened with an anger too old for her years. But Papa wasn't a thief. He was good and kind, and he helped people. Samuel closed his eyes. James McKinnon, a man who'd taken the name Samuel should have claimed, lived the life Samuel should have lived, loved the woman Samuel had abandoned to her duty and his cowardice. A man whose past was apparently catching up to his daughter. "Pack your things," Samuel said quietly. "We're leaving." The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Salvation as Ezra limped toward the general store, his weathered hands gripping a short list Sarah had pressed into his palm. Coffee, salt pork, hardtack, simple provisions for what should have been a simple journey to deliver the girl to her aunt in Cedar Falls. Yet nothing about Sarah felt simple, and the weight of her trust sat heavy on his shoulders. The bell above Morrison's general store chimed as he entered, and Pete Morrison looked up from behind the counter with his usual gap-toothed grin. "Morning, Brother Whitmore. Heard you took in that little vagrant." "She's no vagrant," Ezra replied curtly, placing his list on the scarred wooden counter. "Just a child looking for family." Morrison's eyes gleamed with the hungry look of a man eager to share gossip. "Funny thing about that girl. Jake Henley was in here yesterday, said she was asking all sorts of questions about you specifically, like she knew you from somewhere." Ezra's blood chilled, but he kept his expression neutral. "Children get confused. She's looking for her father." Course. Morrison gathered the items, his movements deliberate and slow. "Still, got me thinking about old times. You know, before you found the Lord and settled here. Must have traveled quite a bit in your younger days." The implied question hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Ezra had always known this day might come, when someone would start connecting pieces, asking the right questions. He'd chosen Salvation precisely because it was the kind of place where men didn't pry too deep into each other's pasts, where a man's present devotion could overshadow yesterday's sins. "We all have pasts, Pete. What matters is who we choose to be today." Morrison nodded, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "True enough. Though some pasts have a way of catching up, don't they?" The bell chimed again, and Ezra turned to see Sheriff Calloway enter, his badge catching the morning light streaming through the dusty windows. The lawman's presence felt like a noose tightening. "Ezra," Calloway nodded. "Pete, beautiful morning." "Indeed it is, Sheriff," Morrison replied, his voice taking on an oily quality. "Just discussing the importance of honest living with Brother Whitmore here." Calloway's weathered face remained impassive, but Ezra caught the subtle shift in his posture, the way his right hand drifted closer to his gun belt. "That so? Well, honesty is a virtue we all value in Salvation." The three men stood in tableau for a moment, each measuring the others. Ezra realized with growing dread that his carefully constructed life was beginning to crack, and Sarah's innocent questions had started an avalanche he might not be able to stop. "Your provisions," Morrison said finally, pushing the wrapped bundle across the counter. "That'll be $4.30. Ezra counted out the coins with steady hands, though his mind raced. How much did they suspect? How long before someone made the connection between Ezra Whitmore, respected church elder, and Ezra Kane, the ghost rider who'd terrorized the frontier 15 years ago? "Planning a journey?" Calloway asked casually. taking the girl to her aunt in Cedar Falls. Should be back within the week. Mighty Christian of you, the sheriff said, but something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of Ezra's motivations. Safe travels. Ezra gathered his supplies and headed for the door, fighting the urge to hurry. Every instinct honed by years of running from the law screamed at him to move fast, to disappear before the net closed around him. But those instincts belonged to Ezra Kane, and Ezra Whitmore walked with measured dignity, even as his world crumbled. Outside, he found Sarah sitting on the porch steps of his small house, her carpetbag beside her and that damned locket clutched in her hands. She looked up as he approached, and her smile was so trusting, so full of hope, that it nearly broke him. "Are we leaving soon, Pa?" she asked, and the word hit him like a physical blow. "Sarah, child, I need you to understand." "I know you're scared," she interrupted, standing and taking his weathered hand in her small one. "I know something bad happened before, something that makes you sad. But you don't have to be afraid anymore. We have each other now." Looking down at her upturned face, Ezra saw something that terrified him more than any sheriff or bounty hunter ever had. He saw faith, pure, absolute faith that he was the father she'd been searching for. And in that moment he realized the most dangerous truth of all. Part of him wanted to be exactly who she believed him to be. Behind them, through the window of Morrison's store, he could see two figures in animated conversation, their eyes occasionally drifting toward his house. Time was running out faster than he'd anticipated. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millfield as Ezra finished loading the last of their supplies onto the wagon. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, securing the canvas tarp over their provisions, but his mind churned with unease. The decision to leave had come swiftly after yesterday's encounter with the sheriff, yet something felt wrong about their hasty departure. Clara sat perched on the wagon seat, her small legs swinging impatiently. She'd been unusually quiet since dawn, stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. The bruise on her cheek had darkened overnight, a purple reminder of Gideon Walsh's cruelty that made Ezra's jaw clench each time he saw it. "Where exactly are we heading, Papa?" she asked as he climbed up beside her. The word still hit him like a physical blow. He'd given up correcting her, at least for now. "North toward Salt Lake City," he said, taking up the reins. "Got word there might be work in the mining camps up that way." It wasn't entirely a lie. There was always work for a man willing to get his hands dirty, though Ezra had no intention of staying in any place long enough to establish roots, not with Clara calling him father and his past lurking like a wolf in winter. As they rolled past the sheriff's office, Ezra noticed the building stood empty, no horses tied to the hitching post. Sheriff Morrison was likely out on his rounds, which suited Ezra fine. The less attention they drew, the better. They'd barely cleared the town limits when Clara spoke again, her voice small and hesitant. "I know you're not really my papa." Ezra's hands tightened on the reins, but he kept his eyes fixed on the dusty road ahead. The horses maintained their steady pace, hooves beating a rhythmic tattoo against the hard-packed earth. "Clara, but I don't care," she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I know you're a good man, and I know you won't leave me like others have. I can feel it." The innocence in her voice cut deeper than any accusation could have. If only she knew the truth about the man sitting beside her, about the blood on his hands and the prices on his head, about the graves he'd filled and the lives he'd destroyed in pursuit of gold and glory that had turned to ash in his mouth. "Child, you don't know me," he said quietly. "You don't know what I've done. I know you saved me from Gideon. I know you bought me food when I was hungry and clothes when I was cold. I know you could have left me in that alley, but you didn't." She turned to face him, her green eyes bright with determination. "That's all I need to know." Behind them, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Ezra had been checking their back trail regularly since leaving town, an old habit that had kept him alive through countless pursuits. This dust looked different, too organized, too purposeful to be casual travelers. "Clara, I need you to listen to me carefully," he said, his voice taking on an edge that made her sit straighter. "There's going to come a time, probably sooner than later, when you'll need to run. When that time comes, don't look back for me. Don't try to help. Just run." "What are you talking about?" "Promise me." The dust cloud was getting closer now, and Ezra could make out individual riders, 3 of them, moving fast and with purpose. His blood ran cold as recognition dawned. One of the horses matched the description of Sheriff Morrison's black gelding. "I won't leave you," Clara said stubbornly. "We're family now." Family. The word was foreign on his tongue, a concept he'd abandoned long ago when he'd chosen the outlaw trail. Yet looking at this fierce, loyal girl who'd claimed him as her own, Ezra felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought dead and buried. "Clara, no. Whatever's coming, we face it together. That's what families do." The riders were close enough now that Ezra could see Morrison's badge glinting in the sunlight. Beside him rode 2 men Ezra didn't recognize, rough-looking types with the lean, predatory build of bounty hunters. His past had finally caught up to him, drawn like vultures to carrion. He had 2 choices: run and likely get caught on the open road, or stand and fight with an innocent child caught in the crossfire. Neither option appealed to him, but Clara's presence changed everything. She'd made her choice to stand with him, misguided though it was. Ezra reached beneath the wagon seat and pulled out his gun belt, the worn leather familiar in his hands. The Colt felt heavy with the weight of old sins and new responsibilities. "Hold tight, child," he said, wrapping the reins around his wrist. "We're about to find out what we're made of." The mare's breathing had grown labored by the time Ezra spotted the dark smudge of smoke rising against the amber sky. He pulled the reins gently, bringing them to a halt on the ridge, overlooking a shallow valley where a small settlement huddled against the approaching dusk. "Is that it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd been quiet for the last hour, her earlier defiance replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "Could be." Ezra studied the handful of buildings below, a trading post, what might have been a blacksmith's shop, and several ramshackle structures that served as either homes or businesses. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and he could see figures moving between the buildings, place called Bitter Creek, if I'm remembering right. Sarah shifted behind him on the saddle. "You think they're still following us?" The question had been gnawing at Ezra's mind for miles. Those riders hadn't given up. Men like that never did when there was money involved, and whoever had put a price on Sarah's head had deep enough pockets to keep them motivated. "Count on it," he said, nudging the mare forward down the slope. "But we need supplies, and this horse needs rest." The settlement seemed to hold its breath as they rode down the main street. A few faces appeared in windows, studied them with the careful attention frontier folk reserved for strangers, then disappeared again. Ezra guided them toward the trading post, where lamplight spilled from the windows and the sound of voices drifted into the cooling air. He helped Sarah down from the horse, noting how she favored her left leg where it had been scraped during their hurried departure from the previous town. The girl was trying not to show weakness, but Ezra could see the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders. "Stay close," he murmured, tying the mare to the hitching post. "And let me do the talking." The trading post's interior was thick with the smell of tobacco, leather, and unwashed bodies. A handful of men clustered around a table in the corner, their conversation dying as Ezra and Sarah entered. Behind the counter, a heavy-set man with graying whiskers looked up from his ledger. "Evening," the proprietor said, his eyes taking in their dusty clothes and worn appearance. "Help you folks with something?" "Need some supplies," Ezra replied, keeping his voice level. "Coffee, hardtack, anything you might have for traveling." The man nodded and began gathering items from the shelves behind him. Ezra was counting coins from his dwindling purse when the door opened behind them, letting in a gust of cold air and 2 men whose spurs rang against the wooden floor. Ezra didn't turn around, but he watched their reflection in the window glass. Neither was familiar, but the way they moved, casual but alert, set his nerves on edge. Sarah had noticed too. He could feel her pressing closer to his side. "Cold night out there," one of the newcomers said to the proprietor, his voice carrying a slight drawl. "You folks seen anyone come through? Man and a young girl maybe riding double?" The proprietor's eyes flicked to Ezra before returning to the stranger. "Lot of people pass through here. Can't say I pay much attention." "Well now," the second man said, and Ezra heard the soft whisper of leather as he moved closer. "That's interesting, because we heard they might be headed this way. See, the girl's run off from her family, and they're powerful worried about her." Sarah's hand found Ezra's arm, her fingers digging into the worn fabric of his coat. In the window's reflection, he watched the first man's hand rest casually on the butt of his pistol. "Lot of families lose track of their young ones out here," the proprietor said carefully. "Frontier's a hard place." Ezra finished counting his coins and placed them on the counter with deliberate calm. "Much obliged," he said to the proprietor, gathering the supplies. He could feel the weight of the stranger's attention like a physical thing. "Hold on there, friend." The words stopped Ezra with his hand on the door. He turned slowly, keeping Sarah behind him. The two men had spread out, blocking their path to the street. Up close, they had the look of professional hunters, hard eyes and patient faces that had seen violence and wouldn't hesitate to embrace it again. "Something I can help you with?" Ezra asked. The first man smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Just wondering if you might have seen what we're looking for. Girl about her size." He nodded toward Sarah, traveling with an older fellow. "Family's offering a reward for information. Can't say that I have." Ezra shifted slightly, his right hand drifting toward his coat. "Now, if you'll excuse us—" "Funny thing," the second man interrupted. "Bartender back in Millfield seemed to think you folks might know something about it." The silence stretched taut between them, broken only by the soft hiss of the oil lamps and the distant sound of wind rattling the windows. Ezra felt the familiar cold settling into his bones, the same feeling he'd carried through a dozen similar moments in what felt like another lifetime. The morning sun cast long shadows across the canyon floor as Ezra checked the cinch on his horse one final time. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, though Clara noticed they trembled slightly. She'd been watching him since dawn, noting how he kept glancing toward the narrow passage that led deeper into the Badlands. "You're scared," she said, not accusingly but with the matter-of-fact tone children used when stating obvious truths. Ezra paused, his back still turned to her. "Fear keeps a man alive out here, child. Anybody who ain't scared in these parts is either dead or stupid." Clara adjusted her pack, heavier now with the supplies they'd gathered from the abandoned camp. The dead men's belongings felt like borrowed time, water, hardtack, ammunition that Ezra had reluctantly taken after checking the bodies for identification. He'd found nothing useful, just torn clothing and sun-bleached bones picked clean by scavengers. "Those men yesterday," Clara ventured, "they called you by another name." Ezra's shoulders tensed. He'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it would come eventually. The girl was too sharp, had heard too much. Sometimes men get confused. The desert plays tricks on the mind. "They called you Crimson Jack." The name hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Ezra slowly turned to face her, his pale eyes searching her expression for judgment, for fear, for the inevitable moment when she'd realize what kind of man she'd been traveling with. Clara's face remained steady, waiting. "That name died 15 years ago, Ezra said finally. "Buried it myself along with a lot of other things that needed burying. But it was you." He nodded once, sharp and final. "It was me." Clara absorbed this information the way she'd learned to absorb most hard truths, by tucking it away and focusing on what mattered for survival. "Are there others who might recognize you?" The question surprised him with its practicality. He'd expected tears, accusations, maybe her running off into the desert. Instead, she was calculating, planning, thinking like someone who'd learned that the past mattered less than the present. "Maybe," he admitted. "Probably. Word travels fast in places like this. and there's men who hold long grudges. Then we need to be smarter about how we travel. Ezra studied her face, this strange girl who kept confounding his expectations. You ain't afraid of me? Clara considered this seriously. Should I be? Most folks would say yes. Most folks haven't been left to die in the desert. She shouldered her pack and started toward the horses. Besides, if you were still the same man who did whatever Crimson Jack did, you wouldn't have helped me in the first place. They rode in contemplative silence for the first hour, following a game trail that wound between towering red rocks. The landscape here seemed older, more weathered, as if the very stones remembered darker times. Ezra found himself thinking about Sarah, about the life he'd tried to build in their small Mormon community, about the careful walls he'd constructed around his past. Tell me about your father, he said suddenly, surprising himself with the request. Clara's grip tightened on her reins. What do you want to know? What made you so sure that outlaw in the saloon was him? She was quiet for so long that Ezra wondered if she'd heard him. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than usual. He had scars on his hands, same shape as the ones I remember from when I was little, before everything went wrong. Scars can look similar. Desert sun, hard work, accidents. They weren't work scars. Clara's interruption was sharp. They were from chains, from being locked up. Ezra felt something cold settle in his stomach. Your father was in prison? For killing a man who tried to hurt my mother. At least, that's what she told me before she died. Clara's voice grew distant, said he was coming back for us, that he'd never abandon his family. But years passed, and when he finally showed up, he wasn't the same man anymore. The pieces began falling into place for Ezra, a desperate child, a father transformed by violence and imprisonment, a family destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. He thought about his own transformation, about the man he'd been before finding God, before Sarah's love had shown him a different path. Maybe he was trying to protect you, Ezra offered quietly, by leaving us with nothing, by disappearing without a word. Sometimes the kindest thing a dangerous man can do is walk away. Clara turned to look at him, her young face serious beyond her years. Is that what you did? Walk away? Ezra's answer caught in his throat as movement caught his eye, dust rising in the distance behind them. Riders, at least 3, maybe more, following their trail with purpose. His blood turned to ice water as he recognized the methodical pace of experienced trackers. We need to move, he said, spurring his horse forward. Now. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty street as Ezra stepped out of the boarding house, his weathered hand instinctively checking the colt at his hip. 3 days in Millbrook had given him time to think, and thinking had only deepened his certainty that staying here meant death for both of them. Sarah emerged behind him, clutching the small cloth bundle that contained everything she owned. Her eyes held that same stubborn determination he'd seen when she'd first mistaken him for her father, but now it was tempered with something else. Trust, maybe, or desperation wearing the mask of hope. The livery stable's just down the street, she said, pointing toward a weathered building where horses nickered softly in the morning air. Old Pete Henderson runs it. He knew Mama. Ezra nodded, scanning the street with practiced caution. Too many faces turned away too quickly when his gaze fell on them. Too many conversations stopped mid-sentence as they passed. Millbrook might look like any other frontier town, but it felt like a trap slowly closing its jaws. The livery stable smelled of hay and leather and honest horse sweat. Pete Henderson turned out to be a grizzled man with kind eyes who remembered Sarah's mother with obvious fondness. He asked no questions about why they needed horses or where they were headed, which suited Ezra fine. Some conversations were better left unspoken. These 2 will serve you well, Henderson said, patting the neck of a sturdy bay mare. Ginger here's got plenty of miles left in her, and the gelding's steady as a rock. He handed Ezra the reins, then leaned closer. Might want to take the north road out of town. Heard tell there's been trouble on the southern route. The warning was delivered casually, but Ezra caught the weight behind it. He pressed an extra silver dollar into the man's palm. Much obliged. They were loading supplies into the saddlebags when Sarah suddenly went rigid beside him. "There," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "By the general store." Ezra followed her gaze and felt ice form in his chest. A man in a black coat stood in the shadow of the store's awning, his attention fixed squarely on them. Even at this distance, there was something predatory in his stance, something that made Ezra's hand drift toward his gun. "Someone you know?" he asked quietly, though he suspected the answer before she gave it. He was asking questions yesterday, about strangers in town. Mrs. Hartwell said he claimed to be a U.S. Marshal, but... Sarah's voice trailed off as the man began walking toward them, his black boots raising small puffs of dust with each deliberate step. Ezra's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Real marshal or bounty hunter, it made little difference now. The man's approach had the measured confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards. "Mount up," Ezra said under his breath. Slow and easy. But Sarah was already swinging into her saddle, her movements quick and sure despite her obvious fear. The girl had good instincts, he'd give her that. The man in black was 50 yards away now, close enough that Ezra could see the star pinned to his coat. Real or not, it would give him authority with the local sheriff if things went sideways. "Mr. Thorne," the man called out, his voice carrying easily across the morning air. "I'd like a word." The name hit Ezra like a physical blow. Thorne. Not his real name, but one he'd used years ago when the Garrett gang had hit the bank in Silver Creek, a name that should have been buried with the rest of his past. He swung into the saddle, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Don't know anyone by that name, Marshal. Afraid you've got the wrong man." "Maybe." The marshal's hand rested casually on his gun butt. "But you've got the look of someone who's been running for a long time, and that girl there matches the description of someone I'm looking for." Sarah's sharp intake of breath told Ezra everything he needed to know. Whatever trouble had driven her to seek her father, it had followed her here. "Like I said," Ezra replied, gathering his reins, "you've got us confused with someone else." The marshal smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then you won't mind coming to my office so we can sort this out proper-like?" "Actually, I would mind." Ezra's voice stayed level, conversational, seeing as how we've got somewhere to be. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the dusty space between them. The morning seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to make a choice that couldn't be unmade. Then Ezra touched his heels to his horse's flanks, and everything exploded into motion. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky outcropping where they'd made camp, but Samuel's eyes were fixed on the dust cloud rising in the distance. 3 riders, maybe 4, moving with the kind of deliberate pace that meant they weren't just passing through. "We need to move," he said quietly, already rolling his blanket. Lucy stirred from where she'd been dozing against a boulder, her face still pale from the fever that had broken during the night. "What is it?" "Company coming, the kind we don't want to meet." She scrambled to her feet, swaying slightly. Samuel caught her elbow, steadying her. The girl had grit, he'd give her that. Most folks would still be laid up after what she'd been through, but here she was, ready to run again. They broke camp in minutes, erasing what signs they could of their presence. Samuel's hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory from years when staying hidden meant staying alive. He'd thought those days were behind him, buried with his old name and the wanted posters that bore his face. The irony wasn't lost on him that helping this girl, this stranger who'd mistaken him for family, had pulled him right back into the world he'd tried so hard to leave behind. They led the horses down the far side of the ridge, moving as quietly as possible over the loose shale. Samuel kept glancing back, watching for any sign they'd been spotted. The riders had disappeared behind a stand of cottonwoods, but he could feel them out there, methodical in their search. "Samuel," Lucy whispered, and something in her voice made him stop. "Those men, they're not looking for me, are they?" He met her eyes, seeing the sharp intelligence there. The girl was putting pieces together, same as she had when she'd figured out his real name wasn't Patterson. No point in lying now. Probably not, he admitted. It's because of what happened in town, because you helped me. Could be. He checked the cinch on his saddle, avoiding her gaze. Or could be they finally figured out who I really am. The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Lucy was quiet for a long moment, processing what he'd told her about his past, about the man he used to be before he found God and tried to make amends. The robberies, she said finally. How many people died? Samuel's hands stilled on the leather. It was a fair question, one he'd wrestled with every day for the past 15 years. Too many, he said. We told ourselves we were just taking money, that we weren't killers. But when you point guns at people, when you live by violence, innocent folks get caught in the crossfire. How many? She pressed. 7 that I know of for certain, maybe more. The number came out like a physical weight lifted from his chest. He'd never spoken it aloud before, not even in confession. A bank clerk in Colorado who tried to be a hero, a sheriff's deputy in Kansas, a woman who was in the wrong place when a job went bad. Lucy absorbed this, her young face grave. And you've been running from it ever since. Not running, trying to make it right. He shouldered his pack, nodding toward the narrow canyon that cut between the hills ahead. 15 years of trying to balance the scales, helping folks, building things instead of tearing them down. But some debts can't be paid off. They moved into the canyon, their horses' hooves echoing off the stone walls. Samuel felt exposed here, trapped, but it was the fastest route to the old mining road that would take them toward the next town. If they could reach it before, the crack of a rifle echoed behind them, and chips of rock exploded from the canyon wall inches from Samuel's head. "Ride!" he shouted, spurring his horse forward. Lucy was already moving, bent low over her mount's neck as they raced down the narrow passage. Samuel could hear hoofbeats behind them now, echoing and multiplying in the confined space until it sounded like an army giving chase. Another shot rang out, and this one took his hat clean off his head. These weren't warning shots. Whoever was back there meant to put them down permanently. They burst out of the canyon into open ground, and Samuel risked a look back. 4 riders, spread out now in a hunting formation. He recognized the lead man's posture, the way he sat his horse like he owned the world. Marcus Wheeler. Samuel had hoped never to see that face again, but there it was, 20 years older and twice as mean. Wheeler had been part of the old gang, the one who'd always pushed for more violence, more blood, the one who turned outlaw work from simple robbery into something darker. If Wheeler was here, it meant word had gotten out about Samuel's real identity. And if Wheeler was hunting him, it meant someone was paying good money for his hide. Samuel looked ahead at Lucy, this girl who'd stumbled into his life and turned it upside down, and made his choice. "When I say jump," he called to her, "you jump left and keep riding. Don't look back." The abandoned mine shaft yawned before them, like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Ezra held the lantern high, its weak flame barely penetrating the darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. Behind him, Clara pressed close enough that he could feel her trembling through the thin fabric of her dress. "Stay here," he whispered, but her fingers clenched his coat sleeve. "Don't leave me alone." The desperation in her voice reminded him of another girl, long ago, begging him not to ride away. That memory had haunted him for 15 years, and he wouldn't create another. He nodded reluctantly. Their footsteps echoed off the rock walls as they descended. The air grew thick and stale, carrying the metallic taste of old blood and something else, something that made Ezra's skin crawl. He'd smelled it before, in the aftermath of violence, when death had settled into a place and claimed it. 20 feet down, the tunnel branched. Ezra knelt, studying the disturbed earth with eyes trained by decades of tracking. Boot prints, recent ones, led toward the left passage, but it was the other marks that made his blood run cold, drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled along the ground. "What is it?" Clara's voice was barely a breath. Before he could answer, a sound echoed from somewhere deep in the mine, Not quite human, not quite animal. A low moan that seemed to rise from the bowels of the earth itself. Clara's grip tightened on his arm. "Papa?" The word hit Ezra like a physical blow. In her voice, he heard the desperate hope of a child who still believed in miracles, who still thought the world might show mercy to orphaned girls and broken men. He wanted to tell her the truth, that he wasn't her father, that her real father might be lying dead in these tunnels, that the world was crueler than she could imagine. Instead, he found himself moving toward the sound. The left passage narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. The walls pressed close, slick with moisture that reflected their lamplight in twisted patterns. Ezra's hand rested on his gun, though he wasn't sure bullets would help against whatever waited in the darkness. Another moan, closer now, definitely human. They emerged into a wider chamber carved from the living rock. Ezra raised the lantern, and the scene that materialized before them made Clara gasp. 3 figures lay bound against the far wall. 2 were motionless, their faces pale in the lamplight, but the third, a middle-aged man with Clara's dark hair, lifted his head weakly. "Help!" the man croaked, his voice barely audible. Clara broke away from Ezra and ran toward the bound figures. "Papa! Papa! Is that you?" But even as she moved, Ezra heard it, the scrape of boot leather on stone coming from behind them. He spun around, drawing his gun in one fluid motion honed by years of survival. Marshal Kane stepped into the chamber, his own weapon already trained on Ezra's chest. Behind him came 2 other men Ezra didn't recognize, but their bearing marked them as lawmen or bounty hunters. Professional killers either way. "Hello, Samuel," Kane said, using the name Ezra had buried along with his past. "Been a long time." Not long enough. Ezra kept his gun steady, though he knew the odds. 3 against 1, with Clara caught in the middle. The mathematics of violence had always been simple, but now they carried weight he'd never felt before. "You know why I'm here," Kane continued. "The Riverside job. My brother's blood is still on your hands. Your brother chose his path, same as me, same as you." Kane's eyes were cold as winter stone. He was 19 years old enough to rob banks, old enough to die for it. Clara looked between them, confusion and terror warring in her face. The man bound to the wall, her real father, Ezra realized, watched the scene with growing awareness of the danger surrounding his daughter. "Let the girl go," Ezra said. "This is between us. The girl comes with me. Leverage, in case you get ideas about running again." Kane's smile held no warmth. "Besides, she's seen too much. Can't have witnesses walking around, can we?" That's when Ezra understood. Kane hadn't come just for justice or revenge. He'd come to bury the past completely, and that meant burying everyone connected to it. Clara, her father, even the other prisoners, they were all just loose ends to be tied off. "There's another way," Ezra said, though even as he spoke, he knew Kane wouldn't listen. Some men became lawmen to serve justice. Others did it because the badge gave them license to kill without consequence. Kane had always been the latter. "Drop the gun, Samuel. Make this easy on everyone." Ezra looked at Clara, saw the trust still shining in her eyes despite everything. She believed in him, believed he would protect her, believed in the father she thought he was. That faith, misplaced though it might be, gave him strength he'd forgotten he possessed. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think I will." The abandoned mining camp materialized from the morning mist, like a ghost town clawing its way back from the dead. Weathered buildings sagged against each other, their windows dark and broken, while rusted equipment lay scattered across the muddy ground like the bones of some great beast. Sarah pulled her horse closer to Jeremiah's as they rode between the silent structures. "You know this place," she said, watching his face carefully. Jeremiah's jaw tightened. He'd hoped never to see Deadwood Gulch again, but Cassidy's trail led straight through the heart of his old hunting grounds. 20 years hadn't been kind to the camp. What had once been a bustling hideout for outlaws and claim jumpers now stood empty, picked clean by time and weather. "I passed through here once," he said, the lie sitting bitter on his tongue. "Long time ago. They dismounted near what had been the saloon, its painted sign now faded beyond recognition. Jeremiah tied his horse to a hitching post that groaned under the slightest pressure. The silence pressed around them, broken only by the whisper of wind through broken boards. "Cassidy's been here recent," Sarah observed, pointing to fresh horse tracks in the mud. "Maybe yesterday." Jeremiah nodded, studying the prints. 3 horses, just as they'd been tracking for 2 days. But something else caught his attention. Boot prints leading toward the old mine office, where he'd once planned jobs that made his stomach turn even now. "Stay close," he murmured, drawing his rifle. "This place has too many shadows." They followed the tracks carefully, Sarah's hand resting on her pistol grip. The mine office door hung open on rusted hinges, and inside someone had recently disturbed the dust. Jeremiah's blood chilled as he spotted something carved into the wooden desk. A crude drawing of a crow, wings spread wide. "What is it?" Sarah whispered, seeing his expression change. "Nothing," he said quickly, but his hands were shaking. The crow had been his old gang's calling card, back when he rode with men whose names were whispered in fear across 3 territories. Cassidy knew exactly who he was hunting. A board creaked behind them. They spun as a figure stepped from the shadows, a weathered man with silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to look straight through a person's soul. "Well, well," the stranger drawled, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "If it ain't the famous Jeremiah Crow, risen from the grave." Sarah's sharp intake of breath cut through the tension. She looked between the 2 men, understanding flooding her features. "Crow," she repeated slowly, "not Carter." "Now that's interesting," the stranger continued, stepping closer. "Little girl doesn't know who she's been riding with. Tell me, Crow, does she know about the bank in Silver Creek? About the family you left bleeding in the dirt?" Jeremiah's world tilted. He'd spent 20 years trying to forget Silver Creek, the job that had gone wrong, the screams that still haunted his dreams. "That's done, Fletcher," he said quietly. "All of it's done." "Is it?" Fletcher smiled without warmth. "Because Tom Cassidy sure doesn't think so. He's been planning this reunion for a long time." Sarah backed toward the door, her face pale. "You were one of them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The outlaws. The killers. Sarah, listen to me." "No," she shook her head violently. "My father, my real father. What if your gang—" The words hung between them like a blade. Fletcher chuckled, a sound like gravel in a tin cup. "Oh, this is rich. Girl's been hunting her daddy's killer without even knowing it." "Shut your mouth," Jeremiah growled, raising his rifle. "Easy now, Crow. Cassidy wants you alive, for a while anyway." Fletcher's gun cleared leather with practiced ease. "Drop the iron." Jeremiah hesitated, calculating distances and angles. Fletcher was fast, faster than he remembered, but Sarah was behind him, and her life hung in the balance of the next few seconds. "I said drop it." The rifle hit the floor with a clatter. Fletcher smiled and gestured toward the door. "Cassidy's waiting at the old mine. Got himself quite a setup there. Been preparing for this day since he got out of territorial prison." As they walked through the ghost town, Sarah wouldn't meet Jeremiah's eyes. He could feel her pulling away with every step, the trust between them crumbling like the buildings around them. Whatever connection they'd built over the past weeks was dying in the dust of his buried past. "For what it's worth," Fletcher said conversationally, "the old man's changed. Prison does that to a fellow, makes him creative in his thinking about revenge." They reached the mine entrance, a black mouth in the hillside that seemed to swallow light. Somewhere in those tunnels, Tom Cassidy waited with 20 years of hatred burning in his chest, and beside him, Sarah walked like a stranger, her hand unconsciously moving to her pistol. The reckoning he'd spent 2 decades avoiding had finally come home. The abandoned mining camp stretched before them, like the skeleton of some massive beast, its wooden bones bleached white by years of desert sun. Sarah pulled her horse to a stop beside Ezekiel, both of them studying the collection of ramshackle buildings that clung to the hillside like broken teeth. "This is it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that moaned through the empty structures. "This is where my father said he'd wait." Ezekiel's weathered hands tightened on his reins. The place stirred memories he'd tried to bury, the kind of lawless settlement where desperate men gathered to scratch fortunes from unforgiving rock, where violence simmered just beneath the surface of every transaction. He'd known camps like this, had even robbed a few in his darker days. "Sarah, child, are you certain? This place looks like it's been empty for years." But she was already urging her horse forward, her young face bright with hope that made Ezekiel's chest ache. Behind them, he could feel the weight of their pursuers like a storm gathering on the horizon. They'd gained some time by cutting through the narrow canyon, but not much. Marshal Crenshaw and his men would be here before sunset. The main street was a gully of hard-packed dirt littered with broken bottles and scraps of metal. Buildings leaned against each other like old drunks, their windows dark and empty. A weathered sign hung askew from what had once been a saloon. "Last chance." Sarah dismounted in front of a building that might have been a boarding house, her boots crunching on broken glass. "Papa!" she called out, her voice echoing hollowly in the emptiness. "Papa, I'm here!" Only silence answered. Ezekiel swung down from his horse, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The camp felt wrong, not just empty but watching. Years of running from the law had honed his instincts to a razor's edge, and every nerve was screaming danger. "Let me check the buildings," he said quietly. "You stay with the horses." But Sarah was already pushing through the boarding house door, desperation overriding caution. Ezekiel cursed under his breath and followed, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt at his hip, the gun he'd sworn never to draw again. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that slanted through broken boards. The place had been abandoned hastily. Furniture lay overturned, and papers scattered the floor like fallen leaves. Sarah moved from room to room, calling for her father, her voice growing more frantic with each empty space. In what had been the proprietor's office, Ezekiel found a newspaper dated 3 months back. The headline made his blood run cold: "Notorious outlaw Ezekiel Cross spotted in territory." His real name, his real face, sketched with uncomfortable accuracy beneath the bold letters. Someone had recognized him, had put the pieces together. The article mentioned a substantial bounty, enough to make even honest men consider treachery. "There's nothing here." Sarah's voice came from behind him, thick with unshed tears. "He's not here. He's never been here." Ezekiel quickly folded the newspaper and turned to face her. The girl's shoulders were shaking, her facade of certainty finally cracking. For months she'd clung to the belief that her father would be waiting in this desolate place, and now even that hope was crumbling. "Maybe he had to move on," Ezekiel said gently, though he doubted any father had ever existed in this camp. "Maybe he left word somewhere else." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from outside, multiple riders approaching fast. Ezekiel moved to the window and peered through a gap in the boards. His heart sank. Marshal Crenshaw sat astride his black gelding in the middle of the street, flanked by 6 armed men. Too many to fight, even if he'd been willing to return to his old ways. "Sarah Cross!" Crenshaw called out, his voice carrying easily in the thin air. "Come on out, girl. We know you're in there." Ezekiel froze. Cross. The marshal had called her Sarah Cross, not whatever name she'd given him weeks ago when they'd first met. A terrible understanding began to dawn. He turned to look at Sarah, really look at her. The shape of her nose, the stubborn set of her jaw, the pale blue of her eyes. Eyes he'd seen before, in a mirror, in old photographs, in the face of his younger brother who died 20 years ago. "Sarah," he whispered, "what was your father's full name?" She met his gaze, and in that moment he saw the truth she'd been carrying all along. "Nathaniel Cross," she said quietly. "My father was Nathaniel Cross, your brother." The words hit him like a physical blow. This child, this brave, desperate, stubborn child, was his niece, his brother's daughter. The family he thought he'd lost forever had found him in the most impossible way. Outside, Crenshaw was growing impatient. Last chance, Cross, both of you. The dawn light revealed what Samuel had feared most, dust clouds on the horizon, growing larger by the minute. He lowered his spyglass with trembling hands, the weight of 20 years pressing down on his shoulders like a gravestone. "How many?" Lily asked, her voice steady despite the exhaustion etched in her young face. 6, maybe 7 riders. Samuel collapsed the brass instrument and tucked it into his saddlebag. Moving fast. Too fast for merchants or settlers. They had pushed their horses through the night, following a narrow game trail that wound through the Badlands like a scar across the earth. The animals were spent, foam flecking their muzzles, and Samuel knew they couldn't maintain this pace much longer. Behind them, the pursuit had been relentless, Dalton's men closing the distance with each passing hour. "There's a trading post about 5 miles ahead," Samuel said, studying the broken terrain. "Place called Hackberry Station. We might be able to get fresh mounts." Lily adjusted her grip on the reins, her knuckles white against the leather. "And if they won't trade?" Samuel's jaw tightened. He touched the colt at his hip, a gesture he'd avoided for 2 decades. "Then we'll have to convince them." They spurred their weary horses forward, the morning sun climbing higher and casting long shadows across the desert floor. Samuel's mind raced through their options, each one bleaker than the last. The trading post was a gamble. It might offer salvation or become their tomb, but staying in the open meant certain death when Dalton's riders caught up. As they crested a low ridge, Hackberry Station came into view, a collection of weathered adobe buildings clustered around a well with a corral holding perhaps a dozen horses. Smoke rose from a chimney, and Samuel could make out 2 figures moving near the main building. "Stay close," he warned Lily as they descended toward the settlement, "and keep your eyes open." The station's proprietor emerged as they approached, a grizzled man with suspicious eyes and a shotgun cradled in his arms. His companion, a younger Mexican with a carefully waxed mustache, stood near the corral with his hand resting on a pistol butt. "Morning, travelers," the older man called out. "You folks look like you've been riding hard." Samuel dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Need fresh horses, willing to pay fair price." The proprietor's gaze shifted between Samuel and Lily, taking in their dust-covered clothes and exhausted animals. "Name's Hutchins. This here's my place." He gestured toward the corral. "Got some good stock, but it ain't cheap." "Money's no object," Samuel replied, reaching for his coin purse. The gesture made both men tense, but they relaxed when he produced only silver coins. "Where you folks headed in such a hurry?" Hutchins asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Before Samuel could answer, Lily spoke up. "California. My PA's got business there." Samuel felt a stab of something, pain perhaps, or an emotion he couldn't name. Even now, facing mortal danger, she maintained the fiction that bound them together, the lie that had somehow become more real than any truth he'd ever known. Hutchins nodded slowly. "California's a fair piece. You'll want sturdy animals." He paused, studying Samuel's face with growing recognition. "You know, mister, you look familiar. You ever been through these parts before?" Samuel's blood chilled. He'd ridden this country 20 years ago, when his name was spoken in whispers and his face adorned wanted posters from here to Santa Fe. "Don't believe so." The Mexican stepped closer, his dark eyes narrowing. "See, I think I know you too, senor. From the old days, perhaps?" Samuel's hand drifted toward his gun. Behind him, he heard Lily's sharp intake of breath. The moment stretched like a bowstring, tension crackling in the desert air. Then Hutchins snapped his fingers. "Got it. You're that Mormon fellow, the one who testified against the Brennan gang in Tucson, made all the papers." Relief flooded through Samuel until the man continued, "Though you look different somehow, older maybe, or scarred." The Mexican shrugged, losing interest. "Ah, see, the holy man who helped hang those bandidos. You are a hero, no?" Samuel forced a smile that felt like broken glass. "Just did what any Christian man would do." But as they negotiated for fresh horses, Samuel caught Hutchins watching him with renewed curiosity. The old trader's eyes held questions that Samuel prayed would remain unasked, because if anyone here remembered the truth, if they recalled the face of Samuel Cross, the notorious outlaw who had ridden with the very gang he'd later betrayed, then he and Lily were as good as dead. In the distance, barely visible against the morning sky, the dust cloud of their pursuers grew larger. The storm had passed, leaving the desert air crisp and sharp with the scent of sage and wet earth. Sarah sat beside the dying campfire, watching Ezra's silhouette against the pre-dawn sky as he kept watch on the ridge above their camp. His shoulders carried the weight of more than just the night's vigil. She could see it in the way he held himself, like a man bearing invisible chains. She'd heard him talking in his sleep again, fragments of words that made little sense but carried enough pain to wake her, names she didn't recognize, apologies to ghosts she couldn't see. The revelation of his past had shattered something between them, but not in the way she'd expected. Instead of fear or disgust, she felt an odd sense of completion, as if the final piece of a puzzle had clicked into place. "Can't sleep either?" Ezra's voice drifted down from the rocks as he picked his way back to camp. "Been thinking." She poked at the embers with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the fading darkness. "About what you told me, about who you were." He settled beside her with a grunt, his joints protesting the cold morning. "Regrets have a way of keeping a man awake." "Not regrets," Sarah said quietly. "Understanding." Ezra turned to study her face in the firelight. "Understanding what?" "Why you helped me in the first place. Why you didn't just walk away when you could have." She met his eyes, seeing the confusion there. "You weren't looking for redemption, Ezra. You were looking for punishment. You thought following me into danger was what you deserved." The old man was quiet for so long that Sarah began to wonder if she'd overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Maybe I was." He rubbed his weathered hands together, working warmth back into his fingers. "But somewhere along the way it stopped being about what I deserved. When I watched you face down those men in perdition. When I saw you refuse to give up, even when everything was stacked against you." He shook his head slowly. "You reminded me of someone I used to know. Someone I thought I'd killed along with everyone else. Who? The man I was before I became Devil Ezra Kane. The man who believed in something better than himself." He looked at her then, and Sarah saw something in his eyes she'd never noticed before. Hope, fragile and uncertain, but real. "You brought him back, Sarah. I don't know how, but you did." The sound of horses in the distance cut through the morning stillness like a blade. Both of them froze, listening. The hoofbeats were still far off, but coming closer, and there were too many of them to be anything but trouble. "Brennan?" Sarah whispered. Ezra was already moving, kicking dirt over the fire and gathering their few belongings. "Has to be. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they reach this ridge." They broke camp in practiced silence, their movements efficient from weeks of running. Sarah saddled her mare while Ezra checked their weapons and studied the terrain. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, offering little cover except for a series of red rock canyons to the south. There, Ezra pointed toward the deepest canyon. "If we can reach the narrows, we might be able to hold them off, or trap ourselves. Better than dying in the open." He swung up into his saddle, his face grim. "There's something else, Sarah. Something I should have told you before." The hoofbeats were getting closer now, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Sarah could see dust rising in the distance, a lot of dust. "Tell me while we ride," she said, spurring her horse toward the rocks. They rode hard across the broken ground, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the stone. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder, more urgent. Brennan's men had spotted them. "The canyon we're heading for," Ezra called over the wind. "I know it because I've been there before. It's called Devil's Throat." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Let me guess, you're how it got its name." "Last job I ever pulled. My gang and I used it to ambush a cavalry patrol carrying payroll." His voice was tight with old shame. 12 good men died in those rocks because of me." The canyon mouth loomed before them, a jagged slash in the red stone that looked disturbingly like an open wound. Sarah could see why it had earned its grim name. The walls rose straight up on both sides, creating a natural bottleneck that would trap anything caught inside. "So, why are we going in there?" she demanded. "Because I know every twist and turn, every hidden passage." Ezra's eyes were hard as flint. "And because it's time I stopped running from my past and made it work for something good." They plunged into the shadows of the canyon, just as the first rifle shots rang out behind them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the canyon floor as Ezra checked his rifle one final time. His weathered hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had cleaned more weapons than he cared to remember. Beside him, Sarah sat silent on a fallen log, her young face drawn tight with the weight of what lay ahead. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, though they both knew the words were hollow. Marshal Hendricks and his men were less than a day behind them, and the narrow canyon offered no other way forward. Ezra's fingers paused on the rifle barrel. "Been running from who I was for 20 years, child. Maybe it's time I stopped." He looked up at the towering red walls that trapped them like the jaws of some ancient beast. "Your real father. Tell me about him again." Sarah's eyes glistened. "He had gentle hands, like yours. Used to carve little animals from soap just to make me laugh." She pulled something from her pocket, a tiny wooden horse, worn smooth by countless touches. "He made this before he disappeared. Mama said he went looking for work in the silver mines, but he never came back." Ezra set down his rifle and took the carved horse, turning it over in his palm. The craftsmanship was delicate, loving. "He sounds like a good man, better than I ever was." The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, distant but growing closer. Ezra stood, his old bones protesting, and handed the horse back to Sarah. "There's something I need you to understand about what's coming. The man they're chasing, the one they call Black Ezra. He did terrible things, hurt people who didn't deserve it. That's not who you are now, isn't it?" Ezra's voice carried the weight of decades. "Blood spilled doesn't just wash away with prayer and good intentions. I thought I could bury that man, but some graves aren't deep enough." Sarah stood and placed her small hand in his scarred one. "Maybe you can't bury who you were, but you can choose who you're going to be today." The hoofbeats grew louder. Ezra counted them, 6 horses, maybe 7. Hendricks had brought his full posse. The old outlaw in Ezra calculated angles and ammunition, cover positions and escape routes, but there were no escape routes. The canyon walls rose sheer on both sides, and the path ahead disappeared into a maze of narrow passages that could easily become a death trap. "Listen to me carefully," Ezra said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "There's a cave about 50 yards up that eastern slope. See it? Hidden behind those scrub pines. You're going to climb up there and stay hidden until this is over. I won't leave you." "You will." His tone brooked no argument. "Because if something happens to me and you're caught in the crossfire, then all of this, every mile we've traveled, every moment we've shared, it all means nothing." The first rider appeared at the canyon mouth, a dark silhouette against the morning light. Marshal Hendricks sat tall in his saddle, his badge catching the sun like a cold star. Behind him came his deputies, their weapons already drawn. "Ezra Kane!" Hendricks' voice boomed across the canyon. 20 years I've been hunting you. End of the trail, old man." Ezra stepped into the open, his hands visible but ready. "Let the girl go, Hendricks. She's got nothing to do with this. Girl's a witness, accessory after the fact." Hendricks spurred his horse forward. "Should have stayed buried in your Mormon hole, Kane. Should have stayed dead. Maybe I should have." Ezra's hand drifted closer to his gun. "But then I never would have met her." Sarah had reached the cave, though Ezra could see her peering down through the pines. Good. She was safe for now. That was all that mattered. Hendricks raised his rifle. "Surrender now, and I'll make sure the girl gets to an orphanage. Fight me, and she'll watch you die slow." The old Ezra would have drawn his gun already, would have put a bullet through Hendricks before the man finished speaking, but 20 years of trying to be better had changed him, slowed him, made him think about consequences beyond his own survival. "You want me?" Ezra called out. "Come and take me!" The canyon erupted in gunfire. Ezra dove behind a boulder as bullets sparked off stone around him. He could hear Sarah crying out from her hiding place, and the sound cut deeper than any blade. He'd promised to protect her, and now she would watch him fall just like every other person who had tried to care about him. But maybe that was fitting. Maybe this was how Black Ezra's story had always been meant to end, not in peace or redemption, but in blood and thunder under an indifferent sky. He checked his ammunition and prepared to make his last stand. The abandoned mining camp stretched before them like the bones of some great beast, weathered timber and rusted metal catching the last rays of dying sunlight. Ezra's hands trembled as he recognized the place. Devil's Hollow, where 23 years ago he'd made the choice that had haunted every prayer since. "This is it," Sarah whispered, clutching the photograph her real father had left behind. The place in the picture. Behind them, Marshal Kane's voice carried on the wind, closer now than it had been all day. The posse would be upon them within the hour, maybe less. Ezra knew he should keep riding, put more distance between them and their pursuers, but something in Sarah's face stopped him cold. "We can't stay long, child. Kane." "Please." Her eyes held a desperation that cut through his defenses. "If there's any trace of him here, any clue about what happened." Ezra nodded reluctantly, dismounting near the camp's makeshift cemetery. Row upon row of wooden crosses jutted from the hard earth, most unmarked, testimony to the brutal winter of 1851, when typhoid had swept through like God's own judgment. Sarah moved between the graves with purpose, studying each marker. "Thomas Whitmore," she read aloud. That was his name, my father's name. The name hit Ezra like a physical blow. Tom Whitmore, the young prospector who'd stumbled into their hideout that winter night, sick with fever and begging for help. The man Ezra had turned away at gunpoint because harboring a witness would have endangered the gang. "Sarah," Ezra's voice cracked. "We need to talk." But she'd found something, a crude headstone near the camp's edge, the name barely visible after years of wind and weather. Her sob carried across the empty ground like a wounded animal's cry. "Here, he's here." She fell to her knees beside the grave. All these years, wondering if he was alive somewhere, if he'd come back. Ezra approached slowly, each step weighted with the certainty of what he had to tell her. The guilt he'd carried for more than 2 decades felt like a stone in his chest, growing heavier with every tear that fell down her face. "He died alone," Sarah whispered. "Cold and sick and alone." No, the word tore from Ezra's throat. "No, child, he wasn't alone." She looked up at him, confusion clouding her grief. "What do you mean?" The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Kane would be here soon, and with him the reckoning Ezra had been running from his entire adult life. But Sarah deserved the truth, even if it destroyed them both. "I knew him," Ezra said, kneeling beside her. "Your father. I was here that winter." Her eyes widened. "You knew my father?" I turned him away. The confession felt like swallowing broken glass. He came to our camp, sick with fever, begging for shelter, and God forgive me, I sent him back out into the storm. Sarah's face went white. She scrambled backward, away from him, her hand moving instinctively toward the small pistol at her hip. "You what?" "We were outlaws, hiding from the law. I told myself we couldn't risk it. But the truth is I was a coward, a selfish, godless coward who valued his own skin over a dying man's life. No," she shook her head violently. "No, you're lying. You saved me. You protected me. You're nothing like—" "I'm exactly like the men who killed your mother," Ezra said. "Worse, maybe. Because I had a chance to show mercy and chose not to." The thunder of hoofbeats filled the air. Marshal Kane's posse crested the ridge, silhouetted against the darkening sky like harbingers of judgment. Ezra rose to his feet, his hand moving to his gun for what he knew would be the last time. "Get behind the mill house," he told Sarah. When the shooting starts, you run. Find decent people, make a good life. Don't let my sins define your future." But Sarah wasn't moving. She stood frozen beside her father's grave, the photograph clutched in her trembling hands. 23 years, she said quietly. "I've spent 23 years looking for him, and all this time you knew. Sarah, please, they'll be here any moment." She looked at him then, and Ezra saw something break behind her eyes. Not just trust, but the fragile hope that had sustained her through a lifetime of searching. The daughter's love she'd mistakenly given him crumbled like sand. "I don't even know who you really are," she whispered. Marshal Kane's voice boomed across the hollow. "Josiah Crane, come out with your hands visible. No need for the girl to die for your mistakes." Ezra drew his pistol, checking the cylinder one last time. 6 bullets against impossible odds. It would have to be enough. "My name," he said to Sarah without looking back, "is Josiah Crane, and I'm sorry." The morning sun cast long shadows across the canyon floor as Samuel Whitmore knelt beside the shallow grave, his weathered hands trembling as they placed the final stone. Each rock felt heavier than the last, weighted with the memories of all the lives he'd failed to save. Mary Catherine stood beside him, her small hand resting on his shoulder, offering what comfort she could to the man who had become her unlikely father. "He died protecting us," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. "That has to count for something." Samuel's throat tightened. Deputy Marshal Thomas Hayes had indeed died protecting them, taking bullets meant for the man he'd spent 3 years hunting. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The lawman who'd pursued Samuel Black Sam Morrison across half the territory had given his life to ensure the girl's safety, and in doing so had granted them both a kind of absolution neither had dared hope for. "More than something," Samuel replied, his voice rough with emotion. "It counts for everything." Behind them, the horses stamped restlessly, eager to leave this place of death and violence. The canyon walls still echoed with the memory of gunfire from the previous night, when Marcus Delacroix and his hired killers had finally cornered their quarry. The French bounty hunter's body lay somewhere among the rocks, along with the last witnesses to Samuel's outlaw past. Mary Catherine picked up her worn satchel, the one that had started this entire journey when she'd mistaken a reformed criminal for her long-lost father. Inside were the only remnants of her real family, a faded photograph, her mother's wedding ring, and a letter that would never be answered. But as she shouldered the bag, Samuel noticed she no longer clutched it with the desperate hope that had driven her across the frontier. Instead, she carried it like a person who had found something better than what they'd lost. "Where do we go now?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Samuel stood slowly, his joints protesting after the long night of violence and vigil. He looked toward the eastern horizon, where the railroad town of Cedar Falls waited with its promise of anonymity and new beginnings. But more than that, it offered something neither of them had possessed in years, a future unmarked by the sins of the past. "There's a schoolhouse in Cedar Falls," he said, adjusting his hat against the climbing sun. "A good one, with a teacher who believes every child deserves an education, regardless of where they come from." Mary Catherine smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since this nightmare began. "And what about you? Will you stay?" The question hung in the air between them like a prayer. Samuel had spent so many years running from the law, from his conscience, from the possibility of redemption, that the idea of staying anywhere seemed foreign. But as he looked at this fierce, determined girl who had chosen to call him family, despite knowing exactly who he was, he felt something shift inside his chest. "I reckon an old sinner like me could find useful work in a railroad town," he said, "building things instead of destroying them for a change." They mounted their horses in comfortable silence, two unlikely companions bound together by tragedy and choice rather than blood. As they rode from the canyon, Samuel felt the weight of his past settling into something manageable, not forgotten, never that, but transformed into something he could carry without being crushed beneath it. The sun climbed higher as they traveled, warming their backs and casting the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber. Mary Catherine rode with growing confidence, no longer the desperate orphan who had thrown herself at strangers in train stations. The frontier had hardened her, aged her beyond her years, but it had also revealed a strength that would serve her well in whatever life awaited them. "Samuel," she said, as they crested a ridge that offered their first glimpse of Cedar Falls in the distance, "when people ask who I am, what should I tell them?" He considered the question carefully, understanding its true weight. She wasn't asking about names or paperwork, but about the fundamental question of identity that had driven her across hundreds of dangerous miles. "Tell them you're Mary Catherine Whitmore," he said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "Tell them you're my daughter." Her smile could have lit the entire territory. "And what about you? Who are you now?" Samuel looked toward the growing town ahead, its church spire and schoolhouse visible even from this distance. Smoke rose from chimneys where families were beginning their days, children were learning their letters, and people were building lives worth living. "I'm a man who learned it's never too late to come home," he said, "even if you have to build that home yourself." Together they rode toward their new beginning, leaving the ghosts of Black Sam Morrison and the desperate orphan girl buried with the past where they belonged.